Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Just a piece of housekeeping at the beginning of today's episode. Next Thursday, I will be in Taipei, Taiwan. I would love to do a subscriber meetup, which I normally do when I go to a major city. So if you are based in Taipei and you have time next Thursday, the 18th, please send me an email at the channel email address in the description below. I hope to see some of you next Thursday in Taipei. We begin today's episode with an economic update. According to new official data released by the People's Bank of China, gold bullion held by the central bank rose to 72.74 million fine troy ounces last month, representing the 17th straight month of growing gold reserves and a new record. According to the World Gold Council, global central banks led by China and India continued adding to their gold reserves in February, on expectations that lower US interest rates are on the horizon. The US leads the world's official bullion holdings with 69.7% of reserves, which is 8,133 tons as of February 2024. But in 2023, China outpaced all central banks, adding 225 tons of gold to its reserves. That was the highest increase since 1977, with total gold reserves reaching 2,235 tons by the end of December last year. In a sign of concern for the economy and households, regular Chinese are buying up gold too. In an interview last month, John Reid, chief market strategist at the World Gold Council, expressed, quote, "From the start of the year, we've seen enormous Chinese retail buying, record amounts of buying on the domestic Shanghai Gold Exchange." End quote. Later in the interview, he explained, quote, "China's real estate sector has difficulties, the equity market is volatile, the currency is weak. All of these things are encouraging Chinese investors to diversify into gold." End quote. However, as US-based outlet Axios explains yesterday, China's gold spree isn't just about financial strategy. It's also reacting to rising geopolitical concerns. The head of global commodity and derivatives research at Bank of America Securities told the outlet on Monday that a big reason behind central banks' gold buying is that central banks don't trust the global financial system. Quote, "After the EU and US slapped Russia with sanctions, which included freezing its central bank's foreign reserves, it made many central banks rethink the kind of reserve assets they should be holding." End quote. Beijing fears that it has become too reliant on the greenback and is keen to diversify the People's Bank of China's reserves. China has been gradually reducing its holdings, which have gradually fallen by a third since 2011 to around $800 billion according to US data. The drop has accelerated since the COVID-19 pandemic. The Axios piece adds that China's gold buying strategy also fits well into its goal to diversify its assets alongside other BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, who are eyeing global economic dominance by 2050. Quote, "As part of this strategy, the economies are aiming to lessen dependence on the US dollar, or de-dollarize." End quote. And this brings us nicely to the main topic for today's video. Next up, we move to the growing closeness in Sino-Russian relations, a space that Western and Western allied capitals should be watching very closely. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is in Beijing this week for an official trip. He has met with his counterpart Wang Yi, as well as General Secretary Xi Jinping himself. Lavrov is also preparing for Putin's visit, likely in May. In his press conference with Lavrov, Wang Yi said that the two countries must adhere to the so-called 5 always, namely, always follow the strategic guidance of head of state diplomacy, always adhere to the principle of non-alliance, non-confrontation, and not targeting any third party, always stand on the right side of a major issue of principle, always pursue inclusive and win-win cooperation, and always promote equal and orderly world multipolarization. In his meeting, Xi said that the two countries, quote, "have worked together to forge a new path of harmonious coexistence and win-win cooperation between major countries and neighbors, benefiting the two countries and their peoples, and contributing wisdom and strength to international fairness and justice." End quote. Yang Jin, an associate research fellow at the Institute of Russian, Eastern European and Central Asian Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, yesterday expressed in a piece that the five alwayses provide, quote, framework and outline for the future development of the China-Russia Cooperative Strategic Partnership of Coordination, end quote. State media sought to push back against the Russo-Chinese elephant in the room, with state-run Global Times writing today, quote, many voices from the West, mainly from the US as well as some senior NATO officials, insist on depicting the China-Russia relationship as akin to an anti-West alliance, which is completely wrong. By reaffirming the principles of non-alignment, non-confrontation, non-targeting of a third party, China and Russia are refuting those voices with a clear stance, end quote. This will unlikely be an unconvincing argument in many Western capitals, however. Indeed, in his meeting with Wang Yi, Lavrov even discussed ways to strengthen their cooperation in Europe and Asia in order to, quote, counter the US hegemony, end quote. Speaking of the US, on Monday, US-based Bloomberg reports that Washington is increasingly warning Beijing to not support Russia's defense industry. The outlet writes that amid signs of continued military integration between the two nations, China has provided Russia with satellite imagery for military purposes, as well as microelectronics and machine tools for tanks. China's support also includes optics, propellants to be used in missiles, and increased space cooperation. The White House National Security Council spokesperson says that President Biden raised concerns with Xi Jinping during his call about China's support for the Russian defense industrial base, including machine tools, optics, microelectronics, and turbojet engines. We also remember that while in Beijing over the weekend, U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen warned China of significant consequences if its companies support Russia's war in Ukraine, expressing, quote, we've been clear with China that we see Russia as gaining support from goods that Chinese firms are supplying to Russia. On their side, China emphasized that it is their policy not to provide Russia with military support. Neither of us want this to be an issue with our bilateral relationship, end quote. Adding, quote, they understand how serious an issue that is to us, end quote. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing all helps for the channel. And for anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is a lot of work, but all your support are all incredible sources of motivation. So thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. To end this part on Sino-Russian relations and the wider geopolitical implications, I wanted to examine some of an essay published in Foreign Affairs this week by Alexander Gabuev, my apologies for the pronunciation, director of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. The piece is called Putin and Xi's Unholy Alliance, Why the West Won't Be Able to Drive a Wedge Between Russia and China. It is a sobering read. We now quote selected excerpts from the essay directly. Even as China and Russia have grown significantly closer, officials in Washington have remained dismissive. They have a marriage of convenience, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told U.S. senators in March 2023 during Chinese leader Xi Jinping's state visit to Moscow. I'm not sure if it is conviction. Russia is very much the junior partner in the relationship, he added. And yet that skepticism fails to reckon with an important and grim reality. China and Russia are more firmly aligned now than at any time since the 1950s. The tightening of this alignment between Russia and China is one of the most important geopolitical outcomes of Putin's war against Ukraine. The conscious efforts of Xi and Putin drive much of this reorientation, but it is also the byproduct of the deepening schism between the West and both countries. Western officials cannot wish this access away, hoping in vain that the Kremlin bridles at its vassalage to Zhongnanhai, or making futile attempts to drive a wedge between the two powers. Instead, the West should be prepared for an extended period of simultaneous confrontation with two immense nuclear-armed powers. Moscow and Beijing do not want to sign a formal military alliance, as senior officials on both sides have reiterated multiple times. Neither wants to have the legal obligation to fight for the other and be dragged into an unnecessary conflict. Still, two large nuclear powers that are on friendly terms standing back to back on the giant Eurasian landmass is a major headache for Washington. What has had a real and durable impact on the order is the fact that in the last 2 years, Beijing and Moscow's dealings have clearly demonstrated the limits of Western coercive power and provided a viable alternative to countries seeking to hedge against dependence on Western technology and the US-dominated financial system. Russia is on its way to replacing near total reliance on the West with reliance on China. It stayed afloat and has been able to wage an expansive war against a large country backed by NATO. Other countries wary of dependence on the West now see how Beijing can be a ready source of technology and payment settlement mechanisms, as well as a giant market for commodities producers. This is the most significant contribution of the Chinese-Russian alignment to the remaking of the global order. If the China-Russia tandem is here to stay, Western leaders must build a long-term strategy that will help maintain peace by accounting for all the ramifications of having to compete with China and Russia simultaneously. For a start, the West will need to find the right balance between deterrence and reassurance with Moscow and Beijing to avoid dangerous escalatory situations that could arise from accidents, misperceptions, and miscommunication. Western governments should consider the second-order effects of the coercive economic measures they have applied to Russia and China and how retaliatory countermeasures further erode the fabric of globalization. And while they should not tolerate Russian and Chinese disinformation and attempts to subvert the functioning of international institutions, Western countries should seek to make some of these institutions, such as the United Nations and its related agencies, functional again, even with Beijing and Moscow on board. When considering how to protect European and Asian security, rein in climate change, govern new disruptive technologies such as artificial intelligence, and address the challenges facing global financial architecture, Western policymakers must now reckon with the reality of an increasingly resolute Sino-Russian axis. Here ends the direct quote. This is sound analysis, but for some analysts it may already be too late. A new era of fractured global order may already be upon us. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of today's episode, especially the Russo-Chinese part and the wider geopolitical implications. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Have a wonderful Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.